Good evening, everyone who's tuning in now and those who are going to be watching this at a later time. My name is Nicole Robinson. I'm the policy analyst for the ACLU of Georgia. Excuse our delay in getting this started. You know, technology issues in the times of COVID are very common, but we appreciate everybody who's able to join us or watch this at another time. And for those who aren't familiar, the ACLU of Georgia is a nonprofit focused on protecting and defending the civil rights and liberties of all Georgians. And of course, we firmly believe that the right to vote is one of the most sacred civil liberties we have as Americans, and that fair maps in the redistricting process are crucial to ensuring that every vote counts equally. So that's why I'm super excited to have the opportunity to moderate this discussion with two incredible members of the Georgia State Senate. We have Senator Tonya Anderson and Senator Harold Jones, both of whom are members of the Senate committee that handles redistricting. So it's a real treat to be able to hear from them this evening. And so I'm going to hand it over to Senator Anderson first to kick us off with a quick overview of her background and experience, and then Senator Jones will do the same.
Thank you, Nicole, for having us tonight. I am so super excited. So a little bit about my background. If people can believe it or not, I'm so young, but I started out a few years ago as a city councilwoman and then a mayor. I served in the state house for a few years, and now I am in the state Senate. This is my first redistricting committee appointment, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve all of Georgia and hopefully navigate through, expand, and come out of this process with a fair and equitable outcome. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for having me. I'm State Senator Harold Jones out of Augusta, Georgia, representing District 22. I got elected back in 2014, took office in 2015. Before taking office, I was the solicitor for Augusta, actually. I was a prosecutor. I did that for about 12 years. I started off as a prosecutor, and now I'm in private practice, and I represent, I do personal injury work, but also represent the Sheriff's Department for Augusta. So that's basically my background. And similar to Senator Anderson, looking forward to hopefully fair maps, and we'll see how we do with that. But, you know, this is going to be a very arduous process without a doubt, but it's one that we can get through, and it's one that hopefully when we get through it, it will ensure that the votes basically will count.
Awesome. Thank you both. So now let's go ahead and get started. And I'm going to kick off our first question to Senator Anderson. And then just throughout this, I'll try to kick it off to somebody in particular, but of course, feel free to answer if you have something that you want to add. So Senator Anderson, can you start off with giving us a little bit of information about what is the state legislature's role in redistricting?
So the state legislature, well, first of all, let me say that our redistricting process is contingent upon the census data. And so every 10 years after each census, the boundary lines of election districts are drawn, and those lines include federal, state, and county lines. And redistricting is the process of drawing state and county district lines to equalize the population and reach equal representation between districts. Reapportionment is the same process, but it's for congressional districts. And in drawing these new lines, hopefully, we will again come away with fair and equitable maps.
Right, and so the role, of course, is the fact that we're the ones that are actually doing the drawing. It's about 12 states, I think, that do somewhat what they consider to be an independent commission, but here in Georgia, we're the ones actually doing the drawing of the line. So when you say what the role is, I mean, it's basically the paramount role. We're going to get the numbers from the census and things of that nature, but the paramount role of actually how these districts are going to come together will be coming through the State House and the State Senate. And as Senator Anderson said, we're both on the redistricting committee, and we've been meeting throughout the summer. Unfortunately, we didn't really have any numbers to go by, but we have been meeting throughout the summer, and you know, we'll continue that process during the fall.
Awesome. Thank you both. And that is a really good point, right? The summer hearings, there were no actual census numbers. We just got those a couple weeks ago. And the point about, you know, we don't have an independent commission drawing maps in Georgia, right? So it is a very partisan process. It's elected officials drawing the maps to decide who will be, who you all will be representing. And in a state like Georgia, where we have had a lot of instances of attacks on the right to vote and attempts to disenfranchise voters of color, that makes it an even more concerning endeavor when we go into this redistricting process, especially what we just had this past legislative session with the Senate Bill 202, the voter suppression bill that passed. I know both of you fought very hard against, and we appreciate that, and sort of voters, especially voters of color in Georgia. So kind of touching on that a little bit, kind of what have historically been challenges or issues that have occurred during the redistricting process in Georgia? I know both of you haven't been through the process before, but y'all are both on the committee, y'all are both super smart. So are there any things in particular that you want Georgians to know about the types of hurdles that could come up based on what's happened in the past?
Some of the hurdles that can come up is the fact that you have an opportunity to basically create what's called, we already have what's called majority minority districts, which is a good thing, and the courts actually like that. But sometimes you can actually create those districts and you do what's called packing persons into those particular districts, where you actually put too many. So that, in other words, it may take 60% to basically win a race, obviously. But where if you say, well, let's just take another 10% of African Americans and move them from one particular district to another, and now you can win by 70%. But the court sometimes asks, well, is that necessarily necessary? And so you look at that and you say, okay, a majority minority district may be a good thing, but is it necessary to do 70%? And then therefore, then let's look, where did you get those voters from? Did you pull them from another district that where those voters might have been able to sway an election, or possibly where those voters might be able to influence an election? So that's one of the things that we've seen historically come up, is the opportunity to move voters from one place to another, which may give one person an advantage and it may to that person seem good. But from a general standpoint, as far as how the legislature goes, the advantage doesn't go towards minorities. So it may go to the advantage of a necessarily one legislator, but it does not necessarily go to the advantage of the whole.
So thank you, Senator Jones, for bringing up that point. And unfortunately, our state and our region has a history of trying to dilute the minority voting strength. And Nicole mentioned it, that you know, we acknowledge Senate Bill 202 as being a hurdle to drawing political boundaries, as another attempt to dilute the political power of almost half of the state population. And so gerrymandering is what we call it. And unfortunately, you know, our state and our region has a history of diluting that. Based on the latest census data, as you said, Nicole, it just came out August the 12th. Based on that data, 33% of the population of 33% of the population identify as Black or African American, 4% Asian, and 10% Latino. If we add 6% of the Indigenous and Pacific Islanders living in the state, people of color represent almost 48% of the state population. So we need to be very clear that this redistricting process is about maintaining political status, the political status quo. It happened before, and I'm sure today, those in power will try to maintain that. But we also have to acknowledge that when we convene later in the year, that we have to make sure that the power of the minority vote is not diluted, and the cracking and packing and stacking and anything else they try to do, we have to push back against that.
And also, let's don't forget that this will be the first time now that we'll be doing redistricting without the Section 5 provisions. So that makes Georgia one of the hotbed places. A lot of persons are looking at, commentators are looking at it and saying that really makes Georgia one of the hotbed places, because you're not going to have Section 5, which is basically your pre-clearance. So a lot of times you could have persons who maybe want to do district lines in a way that's not going to be constitutional, or one that wouldn't pass constitutional muster. But the problem would be, hey, it has to go through that Justice Department, or it has to go through the court, and it has to get pre-cleared. So that kind of cools sometimes on some levels opportunities to do mischief. Now that does not exist anymore. And so that's really a big deal. And it doesn't seem like we're going to get that through Congress by the time we get ready to start drawing our maps and getting them approved. So that's one big difference. It's a huge difference. The fact that the maps actually do not have to go through pre-clearance.
And I noticed that the House passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And hopefully, like you said, Senator Jones, it may not get through by the time we have this special session in the fall, but prayerfully, the Senate can move it right along and we'll be covered.
Yeah, thank you both for your points. And I especially appreciate the points about not having pre-clearance anymore, because that was a really strong safeguard for states, especially states that had previously dealt with Jim Crow and segregation and voter suppression in those ways. And Georgia was covered under that, right? So even though lawmakers and people in power did things a lot to make it hard for people of color to vote and to actually have a voice in government, there was that layer of like a check, and we don't have that anymore. So that's why it's really, really important to have great lawmakers like yourselves, and then also have members of the public to be able to be involved and know what's going on with the redistricting process, because it is less likely, hopefully, that nefarious things will happen when people have their eyes on the process and know what's actually going on in the process. And so I know both of you mentioned the census numbers a good bit, and I'd really love to dive into that a bit. So we just had the 2020 census numbers released a few weeks ago, right? So that's the population count for people who they self-report on the census, and they report their racial identity or ethnic identity on the census. So the results showed, like was mentioned, that Georgia is fast diversifying, has diversified quite a bit over the last 10 years. So the 2020 census indicates that the total population of Georgia grew by almost 11% from the last census, which was in 2010. The white population in Georgia shrank by about 4%. The Black population grew by almost 13%. But the overall people of color population, so that's including Black people, Asian Americans, and Hispanic Americans, grew by over 25%. So my question for y'all is kind of, what do these numbers mean for the redistricting process and for everyday Georgians? And kind of what are the two of you as committee members hoping the map process looks like when it comes to the diversity of our state and the representation and the adequate reflection of the diversity of our state in the maps?
Right, so you want to make sure that it does accurately reflect the diversity. Here's the key thing that we were talking about before, that you don't necessarily put them all together in one spot. Here's the other danger. We talked about Section 5, and it also goes to diversity. It also, remember now, the court basically is now taking itself out of, when I say the court, the Supreme Court is now basically taking itself out of looking at partisan gerrymandering. Well, partisan gerrymandering sometimes can also look almost like racial gerrymandering. But if you can advertise that or sell it as saying, no, it's only partisan gerrymandering, you really can do some real damage. So when you take Section 5 out, and now the court basically said we're out of the issue of partisan gerrymandering, it really presents an issue. So therefore, could you possibly, as we talked about, whether it was packing African Americans in a district or moving them out of a particular district, and say, no, that's not about race, that's partisanship that we're doing that for. Once again, you don't have to go through pre-clearance. And now that the Supreme Court's basically said our hands are out of partisan gerrymandering, it presents a new difficult problem, because you almost can hide behind, which is illegal to do racial gerrymandering, but if you can couch it and say, look, this is not racial, it's more partisan. Well, the court basically said, we don't have any metric to deal with partisan gerrymandering, and that's going to be very difficult to kind of get through. So that's the reasons why this would be one of the more interesting, to say the word, redistricting sessions, because you don't have Section 5, and you also have a Supreme Court, and of course, lower courts have to follow that, who says we're not even getting involved really as far as partisan gerrymandering is concerned. So now you'll have persons trying to say, no, this isn't racial at all, this is just partisan gerrymandering. And then therefore the courts, hopefully on that side, would say to them, yep, we're out. That would cause major concerns as far as Georgia is concerned, because we have diversified.
Yes, I agree with that. I was going to mention that the only thing that is prohibited by the U.S. Constitution is drawing lines that intentionally discriminate against individuals or communities because of race or ethnicity. And Senator Jones he brought it home.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you both. I think that it's thinking through kind of what the census numbers have said and what you both have mentioned, that even lends more importance to the fact that there are additional public hearings with the new census data out, so that members of the public, before when we were speaking at hearings, I spoke at a few, one in Dalton and one in Columbus. And, we were going off of data estimates. Granted, they were fairly close to what the census showed, but it's much better when members of the public can make their voice heard based on the actual numbers that the committee is going to be looking at when drawing the maps. So if I can kind of rewind just a little bit, I know you both mentioned the summer hearings that took place, and those are all across the state from, like I mentioned, there's some in Dalton, the Augusta, Richmond area, Columbus, Albany, but one of the things, there were a lot of things raised during these hearings, right? To the point that the census data hadn't been out yet. There wasn't in-language access for the hearings. It's not like people were able to comment on actual maps. And there were some concerns about a lack of transparency in the hearing process. So thinking back on those hearings, y'all both participated in them. Kind of what were some of your takeaways from the hearings? What were some of the things that y'all heard members of the public saying the most? And what are y'all hoping to learn from that hearing process for hearings going forward?
So what I kept hearing, it was a consistent song of fair maps. We want to see data. We want to see the maps before they're voted on. It was just such a strong cry for fair maps, and not gerrymandering, and shining the light on the fact that Senate Bill 202 has a lot to do with how these new districts will be drawn, and packing, cracking, gerrymandering. It was just a universal song to the committee about fair maps and doing this process in a fair and equitable way. And I mean, it just certain meetings just stand out, like the Mecca meeting, the Athens meeting. Those meetings were very passionate. Passionate people spoke passionately, and I can't see how anyone could ignore. But it was a universal song about the fair maps and equity, and people of color and communities of color, and how the state has changed, how it has grown, how it has grown. And so I still hear it. I still hear it. So that's what stood out for me. And I hope and pray that the committee members hear it and that they act upon it, because this is Georgia's changed. It has changed and is continually changing. So there is just really, with all eyes being on Georgia, there's really no reason why those comments can't be taken or shouldn't be taken into consideration when drawing these maps.
I was very impressed by the fact persons were very engaged. They were very knowledgeable, and they were also very engaged, very concerned. And I'll tell you this, when you start talking about people talking about the fact that they wanted their communities to be together, that really cut both ways, whether it was Republican or Democrat. I saw both sides. You could tell they may say I'm Republican or something of that nature, may say I'm a Democrat, but on both sides, they were saying one of the key things is we don't want our communities to be cut up. That's the key thing. We want to basically, if we can, if a redistricting allows it, we want our communities to stay together. And that goes to what we call a community of interest. So I was very interested in the fact that persons were very engaged, very knowledgeable, but no matter which side they were on, they wanted their communities basically to stay intact.
And you're right, it does go both ways, but you also have to be careful, because it's a thin line between wanting to keep our communities together because it's a party affiliation versus not keeping out and keeping people that are not like you outside. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like a thin line. And I think for the most part, keeping our communities together was more of, okay, we're here at this university and it's split into 3 different districts. Why? We're at this university and it's split into 5 districts. Why? We're in a certain city and it's 5 representatives when it probably should only be 3. So that is the thin line between don't split our districts up and keep people out, kind of thing. So yeah, it does go both ways. It's a very thin line.
Yes, agreed. I recall particularly at the hearing in Dalton, there were
red dresses.
Yes, and there were some people who very strongly advocated for like gun owners and people who really love the Second Amendment to be kept in the same district. So I say that to say though, right? Like people were super engaged in the process and everybody comes into it with their own ideas and experiences, but it's important that they have the opportunity to share that with the people who are making the maps and who are going to be voting on the maps like yourselves. And thank you for mentioning the point about the universities, because that's something that we've been looking at. For example, the Atlanta University Center, which includes Morris Brown, Clark Atlanta, Spelman, Morehouse, and Morehouse School of Medicine, are all divided up into a bunch of different state senate and state house districts. So there are a lot of things that need to be looked at, and members of the public who live in these communities are very in tune and in touch with those things. So again, that just highlights that people want to be involved in the process, and people are very passionate about redistricting and about having fair maps and feeling like their voices are heard in the process, but also when they go to the ballot box. So in thinking about that, and I'd love for you both to answer this question, but why do each of you think that Georgians should care about redistricting?
Because it actually is going to be the determining factor of a lot of policies that take place over the next 10 years, quite frankly. Because if we are doing it in a fair way and we're actually doing it and we're not doing gerrymandering, whether it's partisan or racial, then I think you're going to find many of those maps, many of those areas are going to be closer as far as the parties are concerned, which then will make that more competitive districts where you can actually have a real dialogue about issues and which direction the state of Georgia ought to go. If you don't do it that way and you find that a lot of these maps are gerrymandered in a particular partisan way, especially in a particular partisan way, then what will happen is you don't have that competition, which Georgia really has. You know, we see it now that certainly Georgia is a competitive state. So many of these districts should be competitive, and we've already seen some tinkering that has taken place even before this. So once you eliminate that competition, so to speak, then you eliminate the opportunity to actually have real dialogue about issues, which then you eliminate the opportunity to have real change as far as the state is concerned. So I think that's why you have to be concerned about it, because once these district lines get done, it can decide for a great period of time, you know, what party is going to be in power. And it can decide it more than just one election. It can decide it almost for a whole decade.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think Georgians should really care about this process because, as Senator Jones says, it's going to affect us, you know, for the next decade. And I think, well, I know people should understand how the dots are connected, how the census impacts a whole lot. It impacts the redistricting. It impacts funding. You know, educating the community is one of those things, and having them engaged will help continue to educate them, because a lot of times they don't know how things happen. They don't know what we do. They think we're in DC and all over everywhere else. So I think it's very important that they should care about it, because this will impact their children, their grandchildren. And, you know, as Senator Jones said, this could be a couple of election cycles or a couple of decades, you know, before this, you know, fairness and equity, you know, comes into play. So they have to be engaged at this level so that they will understand how this process works, and then what outcomes, based on these outcomes, how it impacts them positively or negatively.
Yes, thank you both for that. And so we're going to wrap up, but before we close out our discussion, I kind of just want to pose one final question to y'all, and that's kind of, are there any final points that either of you would like to make about redistricting and or the role that Georgians can or should play in the process? I know we've touched on that a little bit, but are there any kind of final things that y'all really want to drive home for folks?
I would say stay involved. Please make sure the same way we had the energy that persons were coming out for redistricting meetings, that we need persons to continue to stay involved. That's going to be very important. Stay involved to where you're forcing that transparency to some extent. People talk about, many persons talked about, well, we already know it's done in the back room. That's not true. And the fact of the matter is, if you stay involved, you can prevent that from taking place. But if you take the attitude, well, it's already done, then it will already be done. And I think that's going to be the key, is to stay on top of all of us, all elected officials, quite frankly, to make sure that we are drawing those lines in a fair way. And fairness may mean that a Democrat may win. We don't know, but the fact of the matter is, you shouldn't be running around gerrymandering districts. I mean, that's just not what you should be doing. And we know that when you do that, you eliminate the competition, you eliminate competitive districts, you eliminate the opportunity to dialogue on issues, and you eliminate the opportunity to actually change things in the state. So, but I will say this, staying involved is going to be the key thing. And I know it may be difficult at times, but that's going to be the key.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I'll say the main thing to do also is monitor this process. I'll make sure that the state legislators know that you are watching this process. Make sure that you're monitoring it, continue to push for independent, nonpartisan, a commission to oversee this redistricting process. As you know, when that happens, it removes politics from redistricting. And as long as the community stands up and says, hey, we're monitoring this, we're going to continue to push for independent commission. We're going to watch this process. We're going to continue to collaborate with our national representatives. We're going to mobilize our community to act on and call our legislators, call the committee members, send letters, send notes, send emails, send postcards. And then guess what? We're going to create our own maps based on the data that wasn't considered before having these town hall meetings. We're going to create our own maps based on the data, so that, you know, as we are involved, we want to make sure that the legislators know that we understand the process and we're monitoring it. So I think that is key.
Yes, agree. Completely on all that. And I will say, you mentioned that, you know, being involved in the process is incredibly important, but it can be hard, right? People have kids, they have jobs, they have a lot of things going on. They're not in the weeds on this stuff like maybe we all are, right? But I will say the ACLU of Georgia, we have a really awesome redistricting page on our website with like a toolkit to help you if you want to publicly testify, if you want to tweet legislators on the committee. We have a list of committee members and their contact information. We post information about hearings, like there are 2 hearings on Monday to talk about redistricting. There's a lot going on, and there are ways to be informed and to get help so that you can be involved and feel comfortable being involved. So I just want to say that, just acluga.org. We have all that on our website for folks. And I do really want to thank Senator Anderson and Senator Jones for joining me for the discussion this evening. I appreciate y'all for all the hard work that you do and for having this conversation with me. I really enjoyed it. And the work that y'all do to make sure that Georgia is a fair and equitable place, I know that we appreciate, and a lot of our members appreciate as well. And
Thank you.
So I want to thank everybody else who has tuned in for this, and make sure that you stay connected through the ACLU of Georgia and with Senator Jones and Senator Anderson to learn more and stay involved in the redistricting process. So thank you all. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.